Thank you, Vicki. Thank you, Bruce. So when you woke up this morning and you were laying in bed, and maybe even as you drove here, or for those of you that are watching at home, maybe you're still in bed. What were you anxious about? What's producing anxiety? Maybe you didn't feel any anxiety this morning. And if that's the case, I would invite you to check your pulse. Because there's a lot, isn't there? There's our own physical well-being. You know, the aches and pains that we're dealing with and the reports that we've gotten back from the doctors. There's what's going on in the world with the pandemic that was a year and a half ago very anxiety producing, and then we felt like things were under control a little bit. And then we were reminded again that things are never really under control. And so more anxiety is produced. There's things going on with our families and our finances that produce anxiety that we worry about. And we live in a culture that seems to relish and feed on that anxiety. A 24-hour news cycle where we're just constantly bombarded with a good half hour worth of news over and over and over again. And if they can keep us scared and keep us anxious, then there's the chance that we'll keep watching and generating more advertising dollars. We're fond around here of a way of understanding our personality called the Enneagram. And there's 9 different types of personalities. If you're interested in that, by the way, we're probably going to start a new introductory workshop of that in the fall. If you haven't had a chance to do the Enneagram journey with Suzanne Stabile, keep an eye out for that. But there's 9 different personality types divided into 3 different triads or stances. One is the feeling triad, one is the anger triad, and one is the fear triad. So fully a third of us, and probably more of us, look at the world and one another from a place of fear. So what are we to do about that? It would be nice, wouldn't it, if we could just say, well, we can follow steps 1, 2, and 3, and we can just get rid of that anxiety. Of course, we know that doesn't work, does it? We've been looking at the past several weeks to guideposts for wholehearted living that a social worker named Brene Brown has done significant research with and interviews with those that are living wholehearted lives. And what she found is that wholehearted people, it's not that they didn't have anxiety, because they did. They were just able to be with it and deal with it. They were able to practice and cultivate calmness and stillness in the midst of what always has been, even when Brene Brown was writing this book 10 years ago, but I think even more now, a very anxious and anxiety-producing culture. So one of the things that she talked about, in calmness and stillness are 2 different things, I believe, is the practice of calmness. Just being with and thinking about how we respond to the things that produce anxiety in our lives. Stephen Covey, in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, drawing on the work and the thinking of Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor and psychotherapist that was the author of Man's Search for Meaning, says this: between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom. So there is anxiety-producing stimulus around us. Our choice is how we might respond to that. How we might respond to that with calmness. And Brene Brown in her book talks about several different ways of doing that, even just taking a breath before we respond, either verbally or otherwise, to someone or a situation. It takes a little bit of practice, doesn't it? There's a great scene in the television show Will and Grace, and I tried to pull it for us, and it wasn't available anywhere. But if you remember that show, Grace Adler was the main female character, and her mother was played by, do you remember who played her mother occasionally? Debbie Reynolds, yeah. And so Grace had a very interesting relationship with her mother, Bobby Adler. She loved her mother, but as you can imagine, as by the actress that it's played by, the mother was very overbearing. And they always had this strife in their relationship. So Bobby Adler, Grace's mother, was coming down for a visit. So Jack, one of Grace's friends, said, well, why don't we role play? And I'll be your mother, and you can practice how to respond. And so in the way that only Jack could, he pretended to be Debbie Reynolds, to be Bobby Adler, to be Grace's mother. And so they were there talking, and he walked in and he said, stand up straight, dear. Don't slump your shoulders. You know, I love that blouse, but that color doesn't really work for you. Honey, when are you going to do something about your hair? And so Grace is sitting there and she's practicing being calm until she finally jumps up and wraps her hands around Jack's neck and says, shut up, woman, or I'm going to kill you. To which Jack says, Grace Adler, you're out of control, and storms out of the room. So we can practice being calm in certain situations. And that is helpful, and it does get us somewhere. But I think if we're only practicing that calm in those anxiety-producing situations, we're only going to get so far. There has to be something else. If we go back to Stephen Covey's words, there has to be a place where we can expand that space for response. I think when we look at the life and ministry of Jesus, we see someone that just about always responded appropriately in every situation that he was in. Where does that come from? I believe that comes from the practice that we know that Jesus engaged in from stories in the Gospels, here and there sprinkled like dots throughout those 4 pieces of literature. The fact that Jesus took time not just to practice calmness, but to practice stillness. In the first passage that Grace read for us, Vicky read for us this morning, he even took the disciples. He said, come away with me. There's all different kinds of ways to practice mindfulness and to practice stillness. But I think as people of the Christian faith, we have the best. We have this figure that invites us to come away, to practice being still, to get out of that cycle of always being fearful and always thinking. That's where we find ourselves so often. In my early 20s, there was a musical that was written and produced by Jonathan Larson that came out in the early 90s. When I was in my early 20s, just became a very formative work of literature for me. And it's based on the Puccini opera La Bohème. And it's the story of a group of young adults that live in New York during the late 80s, the AIDS crisis, and the art that they produce and the relationships that they form. One of the things they engage in that musical is a support group for people with AIDS and HIV called Life Support. And so they go to one of these meetings just right in the midst of the musical. And as so often in support groups, there's an affirmation that they share together at the beginning of that. And it goes like this: there's only us, there's only this, forget, regret, or life is yours to miss. And then somebody, a gentleman named Gordon, pops up, and he says, "Wait a minute, excuse me, Paul." That's the facilitator of the group. "I'm having a problem with this credo. My T cells are low. I regret that news, okay?" And Paul, the facilitator, like a good facilitator does, says, "All right, but Gordon, how do you feel today?" "What do you mean? How do you feel today?" Gordon responds, "Okay." Paul responds, "Is that all?" Gordon says, "The best I've felt all year." Paul responds, "Then why choose fear?" And Gordon says, "I'm a New Yorker. Fear's my life." I don't think that's just true for New Yorkers. I think that's true for all of us. Gordon continues, "Look, I find some of what you teach suspect, because I'm used to relying on intellect, but I'm trying to open up to what I don't know, because reason says I should have died 3 years ago." We can't fix our anxiety by just thinking about it and using logic. We can help our anxiety by hearing the invitation of Jesus to come away with me. There's all kind of ways that we can do that, but I have found, and many others have found, that one of the best ways is this practice of centering prayer. This form of meditation, which is the over and over again practice of releasing the thoughts and anxieties that come to us. There was a great explanation of that in our children's story this morning, but just to recap, it's finding a quiet place and then adopting a word, and it could be a word that we use for a name of God, or a word that we use of somewhere we want to get, such as peace or love, and then just sitting in the quiet. And not using that word as a mantra that we say over and over again to obliterate all the thoughts that are in our head. But as those thoughts come, and thoughts can be anything, that can be thoughts or it can be emotions like fear or anxiety or guilt or shame. Or it could be feelings like our left leg falling asleep. Just allowing ourselves to let go of those, and then coming back to that word. Does that fix the anxiety right there in that moment? Not usually. Sometimes there's a grace that's given and that might happen. But that over and over again practice allows us to practice letting go of those things. And I found, and what others have found, is what that does is that increases that space between stimulus and response as we continue to engage and we continue to practice. And what it helps us do is identify sometimes those things that are keeping us bound up. It's what Jesus was able to do with this one that the story tells us was possessed by a demon. Vicki and I were talking about that story this morning. Just a bizarre story, isn't it? But Jesus was able to name in that person what was going on, and was able to release that one from what was just destroying him and keeping him anxious. And as we continue to practice this place of centering, this place of contemplation, so when we start, it's kind of somewhere that we go. You know, life's a mess. The world's going to heck in a handbasket. Let me sit for 20 minutes and go somewhere else. And that's great. And that's how the practice starts. But what happens is we continue to engage in that once a day, or most wonderfully twice a day, is it ceases being somewhere that we go, and it starts to be a place that we're able to come from. So that as we encounter the difficulties and the challenges and the griefs and the anxiety of life, we're able to come from that place where we're centered in Christ. And so we just do that so life is better for us, right? Maybe. But maybe it's more than that. I think as we start to come from that place, we're able to follow the steps of Jesus and engage some of the things of life that are producing anxiety. As I get older and older, I'm becoming more and more convinced that our spiritual lives just aren't to give us a pat on the backside and get us through the day. Our spiritual lives encourage us and strengthen us to engage the challenges of life. Jesus, the writer of Mark, used a funny word as he called out the name of that demon. Do you remember what that was from the reading? What was the name of the demon? Legion. Yeah. So think about your high school or college history days. What was a legion? What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of legion? Yeah, empire. Empire, the army. And I think what the writer of the Gospel of Mark is doing is calling out the fact that there are things in life, there are parts of our world that produce anxiety. I don't think it's a mistake at all or a coincidence that the name of the demon that was inhabiting that person was named Legion. I think what Mark is trying to tell us is there's stuff out there. And I think the Gospel of Mark does this all through the Gospel of Mark. This is the stuff they didn't teach us in Sunday school. That there are parts of society, parts of our life together that steal peace and well-being and wholeheartedness from us and from others in our society. And I think that we as people of faith, we as people that practice wholehearted living, we as people that are engaged in this spiritual practice, have the opportunity to start coming from a place where we have a little bit of wherewithal and a little bit of strength to stand with and beside those whose peace and dignity are being robbed from them by culture, by commerce, by empire. That is the purpose of our life together. Engaging our own wholeheartedness, creating in ourselves one that's able to face and be with the anxieties of life. And as we continue to grow, as we continue to develop, to be the people that are able to engage those anxiety-producing aspects of our life and of our world. Let's pray together. And I'm going to